Holy Mother, look at her eyes!
What paralyzing sickness is this?
Bridget, wake!
In the winter of 1349, in a stone chamber barely warmed by candlelight, a Swedish noblewoman knelt in prayer when her body suddenly went rigid. Her eyes rolled back. Her breathing stopped. The two nuns attending her rushed forward, terrified she was dying. But Bridget of Sweden wasn't dying. She was seeing something that would make her weep for 3 days straight afterward. Something she would write down with trembling hands, then hide for years before finally revealing it to her confessor. The vision wasn't about murder. It wasn't about theft or adultery or any sin the church preached about from pulpits. It was about something far more common, something almost every Christian commits without even realizing it. And according to what Christ showed her that night, this sin doesn't just condemn souls. It accelerates their descent into darkness faster than any other transgression. The church has the documents. They've been authenticated, but most Catholics have never heard what Bridget saw. Bridget wasn't some isolated mystic prone to religious hysteria. She was born into Swedish royalty in 1303, married at 13, bore 8 children, and served as lady-in-waiting to the queen. She knew court politics, managed estates, negotiated treaties. When her husband died in 1344, she could have lived comfortably on her wealth for decades. Instead, she gave everything away. She walked away from castles and influence and moved to Rome, where she lived in a small room and spent her days in prayer. The visions started before her husband's death, but they intensified afterward. Christ would appear to her, sometimes bleeding from the crucifixion, sometimes radiant in glory. The Virgin Mary came frequently. Saints she'd never heard of would visit her with messages, and Bridget wrote everything down with obsessive detail, filling 8 volumes that would later be examined by bishops, cardinals, and eventually popes. In 1391, 18 years after her death, the Church declared her a saint. In 1999, Pope John Paul II named her a co-patroness of Europe. Her revelations were studied by theologians for centuries. But one vision in particular was quoted less and less over time. It made people too uncomfortable. It hit too close to home. The vision came during her nightly prayer vigil. Bridget had been asking Christ to show her the sins that most endanger souls in her time. She expected to see scenes of violence, heresy, sexual immorality. Instead, Christ showed her a church. An ordinary church on an ordinary Sunday. People filing in for Mass. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then Christ directed her attention to their hearts, and Bridget saw something that made her gasp. Inside each person was a kind of spiritual geometry, a structure that represented their relationship with God. In some, it glowed faintly. In others, it was nearly dark. But in most, she saw something strange. The structure was cracked, fractured, and through those cracks, something was seeping out. Not blood, not light, something else. Christ spoke to her then. His voice, she wrote later, was gentle, but filled with unbearable sadness. Bridget, what you see leaking from their hearts is trust, and once it begins to drain, darkness rushes in to fill the space. She watched one man in particular. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, kneeling properly during the consecration. Nothing about his external behavior suggested sin, but inside his heart, the cracks were widening, and through them, trust was pouring out like water from a shattered vessel. Christ explained it to her in words she would later struggle to transcribe accurately. The sin wasn't doubt. Doubt, he said, is honest. Doubt asks questions and seeks answers. This was something different. This was the sin of secret suspicion. The man in the vision had been hurt by the church years earlier. A priest had been cruel to him during confession. A bishop had made a political decision that harmed his family. And instead of confronting these injuries or seeking healing, the man had simply started to withdraw. He still attended Mass, still said his prayers, still called himself a Christian. But underneath, in the hidden places of his heart, he had begun to suspect that maybe God didn't really care about him. Maybe the promises weren't true. Maybe he was ultimately alone, and he never told anyone. He kept performing the rituals while the trust drained away in secret. Christ showed Bridget what happens next. The emptiness left by departed trust doesn't stay empty. It can't. The human heart abhors a vacuum, and into that space rushed something else. In the vision, Bridget saw it as a dark mist, but she understood it represented a cluster of spiritual attitudes. Bitterness came first, then cynicism, then a kind of cold calculation where every religious act became transactional. The man continued going to church, but now he was mentally tallying what he gave versus what he received. He prayed, but with an underlying resentment, as if God owed him something for his devotion. He helped others, but kept score. And beneath it all was that secret suspicion, growing like mold in darkness. Maybe none of this is real. Maybe I'm wasting my life. Maybe God is distant, or indifferent, or not there at all. But here's what terrified Bridget most. Christ told her that this sin kills faster than anything else, because the person committing it doesn't even realize they're in danger. The murderer knows he's sinned. The adulterer feels guilt. The thief is aware he's broken commandments. But the person harboring secret suspicion, Christ explained, believes they're still faithful. They're still attending Mass, still saying prayers, still identifying as Christian. They see no blood on their hands. They've committed no obvious transgression. And so they never repent, never confess, never even recognize that something is desperately wrong. Meanwhile, the trust continues draining. The cracks widen, and the darkness inside grows denser, heavier, more entrenched. By the time they die, Christ told her, their hearts are sometimes so filled with this cold cynicism that they can barely recognize him when they finally see him face to face. They stand before infinite love, and all they can think is, "Where were you when I needed you?" The tragedy, he said, is that he was always there, but they had built walls of suspicion so thick that his presence couldn't penetrate anymore. And those walls were constructed one small withdrawal at a time, one tiny moment of secret distrust at a time, over years or even decades. This was the sin that pulled souls into darkness faster than death itself, not because it was the gravest sin objectively, but because it was the most invisible, the most insidious, the hardest to detect and the last to be confessed. Bridget wrote this vision down, but she was afraid to share it widely. She showed it first to her confessor, a learned priest named Peter of Alvastra. He read it and was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "This will offend many people." "Why?" Bridget asked. "Because," Peter said carefully, "it suggests that half the people in church on Sunday are in mortal danger, and they have no idea." When portions of the vision were eventually circulated, the response was mixed. Some saints and mystics recognized immediately what Bridget was describing. They'd seen it in themselves, that slow leak of trust after disappointments, that gradual hardening after unanswered prayers. But church officials were nervous. If people started examining their hearts for secret suspicion, what would they find? Would it cause mass panic? Would it make people more anxious rather than more faithful? Some bishops quietly discouraged discussion of this particular revelation, not because they doubted its authenticity, but because they feared its implications. And over the centuries, it was mentioned less and less. Other visions of Bridget became famous. Her descriptions of Christ's passion, her warnings to corrupt popes, her prophecies about church reform. But this vision, the one about secret suspicion, gradually faded from popular awareness, until most Catholics had never heard of it at all. But there's a document that survived. A letter Bridget wrote to a friend in Sweden, a woman named Katarina, who had written to Bridget in despair. Katarina's young son had died suddenly. She had prayed desperately for his healing. The child died anyway. And Katerina wrote to Bridget, "I don't know if I can trust God anymore. I'm still going to Mass. I'm still saying the prayers. But inside, I feel like something has broken. Is my soul in danger?" Bridget's response is preserved in the archives of the Brigittine Order. It's only 3 pages, but every line burns with urgency. She doesn't offer comfortable platitudes. She doesn't tell Katerina that everything happens for a reason, or that she just needs to have more faith. Instead, Bridget writes, "Yes, your soul is in terrible danger, not because you're feeling pain, not because you're questioning, but because you're continuing to perform the rituals while hiding the break inside your heart. The suspicion you're harboring in secret is a poison that will spread. You must bring it into the light immediately." Then Bridget tells Katerina something she learned from another vision. Christ had explained to her that secret suspicion is like a spiritual infection. If you expose it early, if you confess it honestly, if you drag it out into the open air of honesty, it can be healed relatively easily. But if you hide it, if you keep performing religious duties while pretending everything is fine, the infection spreads. It moves from your heart to your mind, from your mind to your will, from your will to your entire personality. Eventually, Bridget wrote, "You become a person who is technically Christian but functionally atheistic. You're going through motions. You're maintaining appearances, but the living connection to God has been severed. And the worst part is that you're surrounded by other people doing the exact same thing." Half the congregation, Bridget estimated, was in some stage of this spiritual dying, all of them pretending, all of them performing, all of them secretly suspicious that maybe it's all meaningless, and none of them talking about it, because to admit it would be to admit failure, to admit weakness, to admit that they're not the strong, faithful Christians they appear to be. Bridget's letter to Katerina gets even more specific. She describes warning signs, ways to know if secret suspicion is taking root. First, you start mentally arguing with sermons while pretending to listen attentively. The priest says something about God's love, and inside you're thinking, "That's easy for you to say. You didn't watch your child die." Second, your prayers become increasingly mechanical. You're saying the words, but you're not really expecting anyone to hear them. It's more like a religious habit, like crossing yourself before meals, than an actual conversation. Third, you feel a small, bitter satisfaction when you hear about other people's spiritual struggles. Not because you're cruel, but because their doubt validates your own secret suspicion. See, you think, "I'm not the only one who's noticed that God doesn't seem to show up." Fourth, you start avoiding deep conversations about faith. Someone asks how you're really doing spiritually, and you deflect with safe, superficial answers. "Oh, just trying to stay faithful." Meanwhile, inside, you're drowning. Fifth, you notice yourself drawn to religious scandals and church controversies. Not because you want to fix them, but because they justify your suspicion. Every corrupt bishop, every hypocritical priest, every institutional failure becomes evidence for your secret case against God. Bridget told Katerina that these signs meant the infection was spreading, and the cure was terrifying in its simplicity. You have to confess the suspicion itself, not just confess your sins. Confess the fact that you're not sure you trust God anymore. Confess that you're going through the motions. Confess that something inside has broken and you don't know how to fix it. This, Bridget wrote, is what most people cannot do. They'll confess lust, greed, anger, pride. They'll confess missing Mass or neglecting prayers. But to walk into a confessional and say, "Father, I'm not sure I believe God cares about me anymore," feels like admitting spiritual failure so profound that it might be unforgivable. So they don't say it. They confess around it. They maintain the performance. And the secret suspicion continues growing in the dark. Katerina wrote back to Bridget months later. She had done what Bridget advised. She went to her priest and said the terrifying words, "I don't trust God right now. I'm angry. I feel abandoned. I'm still coming to church, but my heart isn't in it anymore. And the priest, instead of being shocked or disappointed, had simply nodded and said, "Thank you for your honesty. Now we can actually begin to heal what's broken." But that was one woman's story. What about everyone else? What about the thousands, the millions, who never read Bridget's letter, who never heard this teaching, who are right now sitting in churches, secret suspicion spreading through their hearts like spiritual cancer, and they have no idea they're dying inside? This is why Bridget wept for 3 days after the vision, not because she was shown hell, not because she witnessed demonic torment, but because she saw ordinary, well-meaning Christians slowly suffocating spiritually, while everyone around them assumed they were fine. She saw the masks everyone wears, the performance everyone maintains, and she understood that this collective pretending was killing souls faster than any demon could, because demons are obvious enemies. You can fight a demon. You can resist a temptation. But how do you fight something you don't even realize is there? How do you resist a sin that disguises itself as continued faithfulness? There's another part of the vision that Bridget recorded but rarely mentioned publicly. Christ showed her what secret suspicion looks like from heaven's perspective. To the angels and saints watching from eternity, a person harboring this sin appears wrapped in a kind of gray film. Not dark like mortal sin, not bright like grace, just gray, obscured, muffled. The person's prayers still reach heaven, but they're distorted, like someone trying to speak through thick glass. The words are technically there, but the connection is broken. God hears them, Christ explained, but the person has stopped truly listening for a response. They're praying out of obligation or habit, not out of expectation that anything will happen. And over time, the gray film thickens. It starts as a thin veil, easy to tear through with one honest moment, one real conversation with God, one genuine confession. But as months and years pass with the suspicion unconfessed, the film becomes a shell, then a cocoon, then a prison. Eventually, some people are so encased in this gray barrier that even though they're technically still practicing Christians, they're functionally unreachable. God is calling to them. Christ is knocking on the door of their hearts. The Holy Spirit is moving around them. But they can't perceive any of it anymore, because the shell is too thick. And here's what made Bridget weep hardest. Many of these people die still encased. They receive last rites. A priest anoints them. Prayers are said over their deathbed, and they pass into eternity still wrapped in that gray prison of their own making. What happens then? Bridget asked Christ. What happens to a soul that dies in that state? His answer was more complicated than she expected. He said that the soul itself isn't damned. The suspicion, even when deep and long-lasting, isn't the unforgivable sin. But the person is so encased in their own distrust that even when they're standing before God face to face, they struggle to recognize Him. Imagine, Christ told her, spending your whole life suspecting that someone who claimed to love you was actually indifferent. Then you die and discover that person was real, was loving, was present all along. The joy should be overwhelming, but instead, the first emotion is shame. Crushing, unbearable shame. Because you realize you wasted years of intimacy. You held yourself at arm's length from infinite love because you were nursing a secret suspicion that love wasn't real. Some souls, Christ told Bridget, adapt quickly. The shell cracks, the gray film dissolves. They fall into God's embrace and weep with relief. But others struggle. The habits of distrust are so ingrained that even in eternity, they're still hesitant, still suspicious, still mentally tallying whether God is really trustworthy. And the tragedy is that every moment of that hesitation is a moment of chosen suffering, because heaven is right there. Full intimacy with God is available, but they're still holding back, still protecting themselves, still unable to fully surrender. Bridget asked if these souls ever fully heal. Christ said yes, but the process can be long, painfully long, because the only cure is the same in death as it was in life. Honest acknowledgement. The soul must finally admit, without self-protection or justification, that they were wrong to suspect, wrong to withdraw, wrong to build walls. And that admission, for someone who spent decades maintaining the opposite, can feel like dying all over again. It's the death of the false self. The self that was fine. The self that had everything under control. The self that didn't need help. That false self has to crumble completely before the true self can emerge and finally receive what was always being offered. This is why Christ called it the sin that pulls souls into darkness faster than death. Not because it sends people to hell necessarily, but because it steals decades of possible intimacy with God, both in this life and potentially in the next. A murderer who repents on his deathbed can enter heaven immediately. A prostitute who throws herself on God's mercy in her final moments can be saved. But a respectable churchgoer who harbored secret suspicion for 40 years might spend eons in purgatory simply learning to trust again, learning to let the walls down, learning to believe that love is real and that they're allowed to receive it. After Bridget's death, some of her closest followers tried to get church authorities to pay more attention to this particular revelation. A Bridgettine nun named Ingrid wrote a letter to the Bishop of Rome in 1380, 7 years after Bridget died. Parts of that letter survive. Ingrid wrote, "My sisters and I have observed what Mother Bridget described. We see it everywhere. Good Christians who attend every Mass, who follow every rule, but whose hearts have secretly closed. They are the walking dead, spiritually speaking. And no one is warning them because it's not a scandalous sin. It's a quiet death." The bishop's response was diplomatic but essentially dismissive. He acknowledged Bridget's holiness but suggested that perhaps this particular vision was meant only for certain souls struggling with scrupulosity. Most Christians, he implied, need not worry about it. Ingrid wrote back, more forcefully this time, "Your Excellency, with respect, you misunderstand. This isn't about scrupulous souls who worry too much. This is about complacent souls who've stopped worrying at all. It's about people who think they're fine when they're actually dying, and if the church won't warn them, who will?" There's no record of a second response from the bishop, but here's what's documented and confirmed. In the centuries after Bridget's death, her other visions were copied and distributed widely. Her descriptions of Christ's passion became particularly popular. Her warnings to corrupt clergy were quoted by reformers. Her prophecies about church renewal were studied by theologians. But this vision about secret suspicion was copied less and less. It appears in the earliest complete manuscripts of her revelations. But in later abbreviated versions, popular collections, and devotional summaries, it's often omitted. Why? One historian who studied this pattern suggested that it was simply too disturbing, not disturbing like visions of hell, which were frightening but ultimately served to motivate people toward good behavior. This was disturbing in a different way. It suggested that good behavior isn't enough, that you can be doing everything externally right while dying internally. And that's a much harder message to preach. It's harder to manage. It doesn't fit neatly into sermons about morality and virtue. How do you even diagnose it? How do you know if someone is harboring secret suspicion versus just having a bad day spiritually? The vision opened more questions than it answered. So over time, it was quietly shelved. But the reality Bridget described never went away. And in every generation since, there have been people who recognize themselves in her vision. People who are going through all the right motions, but feeling nothing. People who are maintaining perfect external practice, while something inside has gone cold. People who are, in Bridget's phrase, wrapped in gray film. One such person was a French priest in the 17th century named Jean-Baptiste. He lived a century after Bridget's visions were published, but somehow a copy made its way to his monastery. He read the vision about secret suspicion and had what he later described as a complete breakdown, because he realized he was the man in the church Bridget had seen. He'd been ordained 15 years earlier with genuine devotion, but a series of disappointments, unanswered prayers, and watching innocent people suffer had slowly eroded his trust. He still said Mass daily, still heard confessions, still maintained all the disciplines of religious life. But inside, he had begun to suspect that maybe it was all theater. Maybe the bread and wine didn't really become anything. Maybe the confessions he heard didn't actually absolve anyone. Maybe he was just a performer in an elaborate, meaningless ritual. And the worst part, Jean-Baptiste wrote in his journal, was that he had convinced himself this secret suspicion made him more mature, more realistic, less naive than the simple believers who took everything at face value. He thought of his cynicism as wisdom, as spiritual sophistication. He looked at nuns praying with tears of devotion and thought, poor, simple women, if only they knew. He heard peasants making heartfelt confessions and thought, they still believe it actually matters. And he felt superior, more clear-eyed, less deluded. Reading Bridget's vision shattered that self-deception. He suddenly saw his sophistication for what it actually was, a defense mechanism, a way to protect himself from further disappointment by preemptively declaring that nothing really mattered anyway. And he understood, with horror, that he was dying, spiritually dying, while still perfectly performing every religious duty. He was the gray-wrapped soul, the one maintaining appearances while withering inside, the one who would stand before God someday and struggle to recognize him because the walls of suspicion had grown so thick. Jean-Baptiste's journal records what happened next. He didn't immediately recover his faith. This isn't a story of instant healing. Instead, he did the one thing Bridget's vision recommended. He confessed the suspicion itself. He went to his abbot and said words he had never planned to say. Father, I am not sure I believe in God anymore. I'm saying all the prayers. I'm celebrating all the masses. But inside, I think I'm just going through motions. And I don't know if that makes me a fraud or what it makes me, but I can't pretend anymore that I'm fine. The abbot's response surprised him. The old man simply nodded and said, Thank you. Now we can begin the real work. Jean-Baptiste asked what he meant. The abbot explained, As long as you were pretending to be fine, I couldn't help you. Your soul was locked. But now that you've opened the door even a crack, grace can enter. You don't have to have perfect faith right now. You just have to have perfect honesty. Over the following months, Jean-Baptiste's journals record a slow, painful thawing. Not dramatic visions or mystical experiences, just gradual movement from gray toward light. He started to feel small things again, a moment of genuine peace during prayer, a flicker of real compassion for a penitent in confession, a sudden, unexpected certainty during consecration that something was actually happening. He wrote, I think I understand now what Bridget saw. The sin isn't doubt. God can work with honest doubt. The sin is the performance, the pretending, the maintaining of appearances while your heart has withdrawn. Because as long as you're pretending, you're locked. You've built your own prison. And the only key is the terrifying admission. I'm not okay. I'm not fine. Something is broken, and I need help. Years later, after he'd recovered enough to return to active ministry, Jean-Baptiste became known for his work with spiritually discouraged people. He could spot the gray film around others because he'd lived wrapped in it himself. He could see people who were maintaining perfect practice while dying inside. And he had one question he asked everyone who came to him. Are you being honest with God? Not, are you believing correctly? Not, are you following all the rules? Just, are you being honest? Because, he wrote, God can do nothing with our pretending, but he can do everything with our honesty, even if that honesty is just, I'm here because I'm supposed to be, but I don't feel anything. I'm not sure I trust you. I'm not even sure you're listening, but I'm saying this anyway because I don't know what else to do. That prayer, Jean-Baptiste believed, was worth more than 1,000 perfectly recited rosaries prayed with a secretly suspicious heart. There's a theological question underneath all of this that some of Bridget's interpreters have wrestled with. Why is secret suspicion so dangerous? Why is it worse than sins that seem objectively more serious? One medieval theologian named Christina of Marchiate wrote a commentary on Bridget's visions in the 15th century. She argued that secret suspicion is uniquely dangerous because it attacks the foundation of all spiritual life. Relationship. Every other sin, Christina wrote, at least acknowledges that there is a relationship to violate. The adulterer sins against relationship but admits relationship exists. The thief wrongs his neighbor but admits neighbors exist. Even the heretic is arguing about the terms of relationship with God, but the person harboring secret suspicion is slowly erasing the category of relationship altogether. They're reducing God from person to concept, from father to philosophical principle, from lover to distant cosmic force. And once that reduction happens, nothing else matters. You can't sin against a concept. You can't repent to a principle. You can't be reconciled with a distant force. All the mechanics of spiritual life presuppose that there's an actual relationship, that God is not just real but relationally present, knowable, responsive. The person wrapped in secret suspicion has subtly redefined God as something that doesn't require their trust because it doesn't offer relationship anyway. And this, Christina argued, is why Christ showed Bridget that particular sin, because it's the one that makes all other spiritual medicine useless. You can't confess meaningfully if you suspect confession is just talking to yourself. You can't receive communion fruitfully if you suspect you're just eating bread. You can't pray with any expectation if you suspect no one is listening. The entire sacramental system, the entire spiritual life of the Church, rests on the foundation of trust. Not perfect trust, not constant trust, not trust that never has questions or struggles, but basic trust that there's actually someone there. That relationship is possible. That God is not just an idea, but a real person who knows you and loves you and is present. Secret suspicion erodes that foundation, and once the foundation cracks enough, everything built on it becomes unstable. This is why, Christina concluded, Bridget wept for 3 days, because she saw how many souls were living on cracked foundations. How many were one more disappointment away from complete collapse? How many were already collapsed but hadn't admitted it yet? And she knew that unless they confessed the crack itself, unless they admitted the foundation was failing, there was no way to repair it. You can't fix a problem you won't acknowledge exists. So what does this mean for us? For people reading about Bridget's vision 700 years later? First, we have to be honest enough to ask if we recognize the pattern in ourselves. Are we going through religious motions while something inside has gone cold? Are we maintaining appearances while secretly suspicious that maybe it's all meaningless? Are we praying words we don't expect anyone to hear? Second, if we recognize even a trace of this pattern, the prescription is the same as it was for Katerina, for Jean-Baptiste, for everyone Bridget ever counseled. Confess the suspicion itself, not just your sins. The fact that you're not sure you trust God anymore. Third, we have to understand that this isn't about forcing ourselves to feel things we don't feel. It's not about pretending to have certainty we don't have. It's about honesty, about dragging what's hidden into the light, because secret suspicion thrives in darkness. Spoken aloud, acknowledged, confessed, it loses much of its power. Fourth, we need to have compassion for how common this is. Bridget estimated that half the people in church were struggling with this in some form. That means it's normal. It means you're not uniquely broken. It means this is part of the human condition in a world where prayers aren't always answered the way we want, and innocent people suffer, and God often feels absent. But there's something else Bridget said that's crucial. In a later vision, Christ told her that he never holds secret suspicion against a soul if they're honestly trying to fight it. The sin, he said, is in the hiding, in the pretending, in the maintaining of false appearances. A person who comes to him and says, "I'm struggling to trust you. I'm here anyway. Help me," is infinitely more pleasing to him than someone who performs perfect devotions while their heart is locked away. Because the first person is in relationship, even if it's struggling relationship. The second person has withdrawn from relationship while pretending everything is fine. And God, Bridget wrote, would rather have our honest mess than our performed perfection. He would rather we come to him angry, doubting, confused, suspicious, and real than that we stay away while pretending to be close. The secret suspicion becomes deadly only when we nurse it in hiding, when we let it grow in the dark, when we pretend it's not there, while it slowly poisons everything. Brought into the light, confessed honestly, offered to God as our real state, it can be healed. Not instantly, not easily, but it can be healed. Bridget spent the last 20 years of her life in Rome, living in a small apartment near the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere. Pilgrims would come to see her, seeking advice, asking for prayers, and those who knew her well said she asked everyone the same question eventually. Are you being honest with God? Sometimes people were offended. They'd list their devotions, their prayers, their good works, and Bridget would listen patiently, then ask again, but are you being honest with God about the state of your heart? Many people couldn't answer, because they'd never thought about it that way. They'd confused religious activity with relationship. They'd mistaken performance for presence. And Bridget would gently point out that all their activity, all their devotion, meant nothing if their heart had secretly withdrawn. It's better, she told them, to pray one honest sentence than 1,000 dishonest prayers. Better to sit in silence, admitting you feel nothing, than to recite elaborate devotions while hiding behind the words. God doesn't need our performances. He wants our hearts, and He can't have our hearts if we've locked them away behind walls of secret suspicion. When Bridget died in 1373, her last words were reportedly, "Tell them to stop pretending." Her followers weren't sure exactly what she meant. Tell who to stop pretending what? But one of her daughters, Catherine, believed she understood. Bridget had spent decades seeing souls wrapped in gray film. People who looked fine externally, but were dying internally. And her final wish was that someone would tell them the truth. Stop pretending you're fine when you're not. Stop performing devotion you don't feel. Stop maintaining appearances while your heart has withdrawn. Just stop. Be honest. Confess the real state of your soul, however dark or cold or suspicious it might be. Because only honesty can heal what pretending has broken. This was the urgent message Bridget tried to leave behind. Not complicated theology, not elaborate spiritual techniques. Just stop pretending. Be honest. Let God see your real heart, not the one you think you're supposed to have. The sin that pulls souls into darkness faster than death isn't the dramatic sins everyone fears. It's the quiet withdrawal, the secret suspicion, the slow, hidden erosion of trust while maintaining perfect external appearances. And the cure is terrifyingly simple but almost impossibly hard. Honesty. So if you've read this and recognized yourself even slightly, if you've felt that gray film, if you've caught yourself maintaining appearances while something inside has gone cold, you know what you have to do. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel ready. Now, find a priest, a spiritual director, a trusted friend, and say the words that terrify you. I think I've stopped trusting God. I'm still doing all the right things, but my heart isn't in it anymore. Something has broken, and I don't know how to fix it. I need help. Those words will feel like spiritual death, like admitting complete failure, like tearing away the last shred of your self-image as a faithful person. But on the other side of that small death is the only thing that can save you. Real relationship. Not performed. Not pretended. Real. And Bridget saw, in that vision 700 years ago, that real relationship is the only thing God actually wants from us. Everything else, all the prayers and devotions and good works, they're only valuable if they flow from real relationship. Without that foundation of honest trust, they're just noise, just motion, just gray souls wrapped in gray film, slowly suffocating in darkness of their own making. Stop pretending. Be honest. Let the walls crack. Let the gray film tear. Let God see who you really are right now, not who you think you should be. That's the cure. That's always been the cure. And that's what Bridget died trying to tell us. If this message helped you reflect or brought you any clarity, consider subscribing or leaving a comment. These teachings are meant to guide and protect, and your support helps them reach the people who may truly need them. It isn't for numbers, it's for spreading what is good, true, and important. Thank you for being here. May God's grace be with you.